The Davis twins. Before we start, just a reminder, if you enjoy this kind of content, subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get to the video. The Winter School Portrait. The photograph arrived at the Chicago Historical Society on a bitter February morning in wrapped in brown paper and accompanied by a letter written in shaky handwriting. Margaret Thornton, the Society's chief archivist, carefully unwrapped the package in her climate-controlled office, revealing a sepia-toned school photograph that immediately caught her attention. The image was clearly from the early 1900s, evidenced by the children's heavy wool coats, knitted scarves, and the formal poses typical of the era. The photograph showed approximately 20 children, arranged in 3 rows in front of a brick schoolhouse, its windows frosted with winter's thatch and snow piled high against its foundation. The building itself was typical of Chicago's public schools. From that period, solid, imposing, built to withstand both harsh winters and the test of time. Margaret adjusted her reading glasses and examined the photograph more closely under the bright LED lamp on her desk. The children's faces were solemn, as was customary for photographs of that era, when exposure times were long and smiling was considered inappropriate for formal portraits. Their clothing spoke of working-class families, patched coats, hand-knitted mittens, and boots that had clearly seen many winters. But it was the accompanying letter that made Margaret's pulse quicken with curiosity. Written in the careful script of someone well into their 90s, it read, "Dear Historical Society, I am donating this photograph of Lincoln Elementary School's winter class of 1912. I am 92 years old and the last surviving student from this photograph. Before I pass, I need someone to understand what we all saw that day but were too frightened to speak about. Look carefully at the Davis twins. You'll see what I mean. This has haunted me for over a century." Eleanor Whitman, née Patterson. Margaret's eyes immediately searched the photograph for the twins mentioned in the letter. It didn't take long to spot them, 2 boys who appeared to be around 10 years old, standing in different sections of the group. They were dressed identically in dark wool coats with brass buttons, matching knitted caps, and small leather boots. Their faces were remarkably similar, sharing the same sharp jawline, the same deep-set eyes, and the same serious expression that seemed more intense than the other children. What struck Margaret as odd was their positioning. In group photographs of this era, siblings were typically placed together, especially twins who were often dressed alike to emphasize their bond. Yet these 2 boys were separated, one standing in the back row on the far left, the other in the front row on the far right, as if deliberately positioned to be as far apart as possible while still remaining in the frame. Margaret reached for her magnifying glass, a tool she'd used countless times in her 20-year career examining historical documents and photographs. As she moved the lens across the image, focusing on each twin individually, a chill ran down her spine. The boys weren't just similar, they were identical in every conceivable way. Not just their clothing, which could be explained by parents dressing twins alike, but their exact posture, the precise angle of their heads, the identical positioning of their hands at their sides. Even more unsettling was their facial expression, not just similar, but absolutely identical, down to the smallest detail. The same slight furrow in their brows, the same barely perceptibly downturn of their mouths, the same distant look in their eyes. Margaret examined thousands of photographs throughout her career, including many featuring twins. She understood that siblings, even identical twins, had subtle differences in their expressions, their posture, their individual personalities that came through even in formal portraits. But these 2 boys appeared to be exact duplicates, as if the same person had somehow been photographed twice in the same image. She set down the magnifying glass and rubbed her eyes, wondering if fatigue was playing tricks on her vision. But when she looked again, the impossibility remained. The photograph showed clear signs of being an original. The sepia toning was consistent throughout. There were no visible signs of double exposure or manipulation. and the grain and texture were uniform across the entire image. Margaret turned their attention to the other children in the photograph, searching for clues or context. Their expressions ranged from the typical solemnity expected in formal portraits to what appeared to be subtle unease. Several children seemed to be deliberately avoiding looking in the direction of either twin, their gazes fixed firmly forward or slightly downward. One little girl in the middle row appeared to be leaning away from the twin in the back row, though she was several positions away from him. The more Margaret studied the photograph, the more details emerged that suggested something unusual had occurred during its taking. The photographer's shadow was visible at the bottom edge of the frame, indicating the camera had been positioned at a specific angle. The lighting was consistent with a winter day, but there seemed to be an odd quality to the shadows cast by the twins. They appeared slightly darker, more defined than those of the other children. Margaret reached for her phone and called James Morrison, a photography expert and historian, who had consulted with the Historical Society on numerous occasions. If anyone could explain what she was seeing, it would be him. "Jim, I need you to look at something," she said when he answered. "Can you come in today? I have a photograph from Ninta Indian Suades. Well, it's unlike anything I've seen before." Dr. Morrison arrived within the hour, his curiosity piqued by the urgency in Margaret's voice. A tile-seen man in his 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetually inquisitive expression. He had spent his career studying the technical aspects of argillic photography and had written several books on the subject. Margaret showed him the photograph and Eleanor Whitman's letter, watching his face carefully as he examined the image. His initial expression of professional interest gradually shifted to one of puzzlement, then genuine concern. "This is extraordinary," he murmured, adjusting his glasses and leaning closer to the photograph. "The technical quality suggests this is definitely an original from the period. The sepia toning, the paper stock, the grain structure, all consistent with..." He picked up Margaret's magnifying glass and began his own detailed examination. The lighting is consistent throughout the image, which rules out composite photography. The shadows all fall in the same direction. The depth of field is uniform. He paused, focusing on the twin. "But this is impossible." "What do you mean?" Dr. Morrison straightened up, removing his glasses to clean them. "A nervous habit," Margaret had observed during their previous consultations. "These aren't just similar children, Margaret. Look at this." He pointed to specific details on each twin. The exact same crease in their coats, the identical way their caps sit on their heads, even the same small scuff mark on their left boots. This level of similarity is beyond what you'd expect even from identical twins. Margaret felt a mixture of vindication and unease. "So you see it too." He said, "But I can't explain it." In 1901, the technology for this kind of photographic manipulation simply didn't exist. Double exposure was possible, but it would leave telltale signs, ghosting, inconsistent lighting, variations in image density. This photograph shows none of those characteristics. Dr. Morrison continued his examination, paying particular attention to the areas around each twin. "There's something else," he said slowly. "Look at the other children's positioning. It's as if they're unconsciously creating space around both twins, even though they're in completely different parts of the group." Margaret nodded. "I noticed that too. And look at their expressions. Several of them seem uncomfortable, as if they sensed something was wrong but couldn't articulate what it was." Dr. Morrison set down the magnifying glass and looked at Margaret directly. "I think we need to research this photograph more thoroughly. The letter mentions Lincoln Elementary School. If it's still standing, there might be records, other photographs from the same period." Margaret was already reaching for her computer. Lincoln Elementary was demolished in 1987, but the Chicago Public Schools archives should have records. And if Eleanor Whitman is still alive, at 98, we should speak with her as soon as possible. Dr. Morrison agreed. She may be the only person left who can tell us what really happened that day. As Margaret began her research, she couldn't shake the feeling that the photograph was more than just an historical curiosity. There was something deeply unsettling about the image, something that went beyond the technical impossibility of what it appeared to show. The twins' identical expressions seemed to follow her as she worked, their dark eyes holding secrets that had remained buried for over a century. The winter light fading outside her office window seemed to echo the atmosphere captured in the photograph, cold, mysterious, and filled with the promise of revelations that might be better left undiscovered. Margaret spent the rest of the day diving deep into Chicago Public Schools archives, searching for any records related to Lincoln Elementary. The digital databases yielded some basic information: enrollment records, teacher assignments, and a few administrative documents, but nothing that specifically mentioned the Davis twins or provided context for the mysterious photograph. Morrison had returned to his office, but promised to conduct his own research into early 20th century photography techniques, hoping to find some technical explanation for what they had observed. Margaret, meanwhile, focused on the more immediate challenge of locating Eleanor Whitman. The letter had been postmarked from Evanston, a suburb north of Chicago. Margaret began with online directories, then moved to nursing home registries and assisted living facilities in the area. After several hours of phone calls and dead ends, she finally found what she was looking for. Sunset Manor Assisted Living, came in the cheerful voice on the other end of the line. How may I help you? I'm looking for a resident named Eleanor Whitman. I'm Margaret Thornton, from the Chicago Historical Society, and I believe she recently sent us a historical photograph. There was a pause. Oh yes, Mrs. Whitman. She's been talking about that photograph for weeks. She's in room 27. But I should warn you, she's been quite agitated lately, especially when discussing anything related to her childhood. Are you planning to visit? If possible, yes. This photograph is quite significant historically, and Mrs. Whitman may be the only person who can provide context for it. I'll let her know you're coming. Visiting hours are until 8 p.m. Margaret gathered the photograph and Eleanor's letter, along with a digital camera and recording device. If Eleanor was indeed the last surviving witness to whatever had happened in 19... Sunset Manor was a well-maintained facility with warm lighting and comfortable common areas where elderly residents gathered to watch television or play cards. Margaret found room 27 at the end of a quiet hallway, its door slightly ajar. She knocked gently. Coming in came a surprisingly strong voice from within. Eleanor Whitman was sitting in a wheelchair by the window, looking out at the late afternoon sky. Despite her advanced age, her posture was erect, and her eyes were sharp and alert. Her white hair was neatly arranged, and she wore a simple blue dress with a small brooch at the collar. You're from the Historical Society, Eleanor said without turning around. It wasn't a question. Yes, ma'am. I'm Margaret Thornton. Thank you for donating the photograph. It's quite remarkable. Eleanor finally turned to face her, and Margaret was struck by the intensity of her gaze. Remarkable isn't the word I'd use. Disturbing, perhaps. Impossible, certainly. She gestured to a chair beside her bed. Please, sit down. I've been waiting for someone to take this seriously for over a century. Margaret settled into the chair and carefully removed the photograph from its protective sleeve. Eleanor's reaction was immediate and visceral. She recoiled slightly, her hands gripping the arms of her wheelchair. "You haven't seen that image in decades," Eleanor whispered. "I'd hoped never to see it again. Mrs. Whitman, can you tell me about the day this photograph was taken?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the image. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of memories that had been carefully guarded for nearly a lifetime. It was February 14th, Valentine's Day, though we didn't celebrate such things at Lincoln Elementary. The photographer, Miss Kelderman, I think his name was, had come to take our annual winter class portrait. We were all excited because we rarely had our pictures taken. She paused, reaching for a glass of water on her bedside table. Margaret noticed that her hands trembled slightly. The Davis twins were new to our school. They'd started in January, just a few weeks before the photograph. Thomas and Timothy, though we could never tell them apart, their family had moved from somewhere back east. Pennsylvania, I think. What do you remember about them? Eleanor's expression darkened. They were strange children, not just because they were identical, but because they seemed to share thoughts, finish each other's sentences. They would move in perfect synchronization, even when they weren't trying to. It was unsettling. Margaret leaned forward. Can you tell me about the day the photograph was taken? We were arranged outside the school building. It was terribly cold, one of the coldest days of that winter. Mr. Kellerman spent a long time positioning us, making sure everyone was visible. The Davis twins were placed on opposite sides of the group. Do you remember why they were separated? Eleanor nodded slowly. Miss Henderson, our teacher, said it was to balance the composition, but I think the real reason was that having them stand together made everyone uncomfortable. When they were side by side, it was like looking at one person and their reflection. Margaret showed Eleanor the photograph, pointing to the twins. Mrs. Whitman, do you see what we see? The identical positioning, the exact same expressions. Eleanor's face went pale. You see it too. She was quiet for a moment, then continued in a whisper. That day, when Mr. Kellerman was preparing to take the photograph, something strange happened. Timothy, at least, I think it was Timothy, was standing in the back row, but just as the flash went off, I saw him in the front row as well. Not moving from one place to another, but actually in both places at the same time. Margaret felt her heart racing. What do you mean? I mean I saw one boy in two places simultaneously. The other children saw it too. I could tell by their faces. Some of them started crying. Miss Henderson tried to calm us down, said it was just the bright flash playing tricks on our eyes. But we knew what we'd seen. Eleanor reached out and touched the photograph with one finger, tracing the outline of one of the twins. After the photograph was developed and copies were distributed to the families, most of the parents demanded that their copies be destroyed. They said it was unnatural and disturbing. But a few copies survived. What happened to the Davis twins after that? Eleanor's expression grew even more troubled. They disappeared 3 days later. Their family packed up in the middle of the night and left town. No farming address, no explanation. Miss Henderson told us they'd moved back east, but she shook her head. I never believed that. Why not? Because of what happened the day before they left. I was walking home from school when I saw them in Millennium Park, or what would become Millennium Park decades later. They were standing by the lake, but they weren't together. One was on the shore, the other was in the water. But not drowning, not swimming, just standing there, as if the water was solid ground. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Did anyone else see this? I don't know. I ran home and told my mother, but she said I was making up stories. The next day, the twins were gone. Eleanor turned back to the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. I've spent my entire life trying to understand what I saw that day. I've read about twins, about psychology, about photography. Nothing explains it. Margaret carefully returned the photograph to its protective sleeve. Mrs. Whitman, would you be willing to speak with a photographic expert about this? Dr. Morrison is trying to understand the technical aspects of the image. Of course, but I should warn you, this photograph has a way of affecting people. Everyone who studied it seriously has reported experiences. What kind of experiences? Eleanor smiled sadly. Dreams, mostly. Dreams of standing in two places at once, of seeing your reflection move independently. Some people report seeing the twins in other old photographs, always in impossible positions. As Margaret prepared to leave, Eleanor called out to her, Miss Thornton, be careful with that photograph. Whatever the Davis twins were, whatever happened to them, it's somehow preserved in that image. and empties are better left undisturbed. Driving back to the historical society, through the darkening Chicago streets, Margaret couldn't shake Eleanor's words. The photograph, safely secured in her briefcase, seemed to pulse with an energy that defied explanation.
She found herself checking her rearview mirror more frequently than usual, half expecting to see identical figures following her car. When she finally reached her apartment, Margaret placed the photograph in a secure drawer and tried to put the day's revelations out of her mind. But as she drifted off to sleep, she dreamed of standing in a snowy schoolyard, watching two identical boys who cast the same shadow despite being on opposite sides of the frame. Morrison arrived at the Historical Society early the next morning, carrying a large case filled with specialized equipment. Margaret called him the previous evening to share Eleanor Whitman's account, and he had spent the night researching every possible technical explanation for the phenomenon captured in the 1911 photograph. "I've brought everything," he announced, setting up his equipment on Margaret's desk. Hydrosilocin scanner, spectral analysis tools, even a microscope for examining the paper fibers. "If there's a technical explanation for this image, we'll find it." Margaret watched as Dr. Morrison carefully positioned the photograph under a high-powered magnifying system connected to a computer monitor. The image appeared on the screen in stunning detail, revealing aspects that weren't visible to the naked eye. "First, let's examine the paper and chemical composition," Morrison said, adjusting the focus. "This will tell us definitively whether the photograph is from 1910 or the time and whether it's been altered." The analysis took several hours. Morrison examined every aspect of the photograph: the paper stack, the sepia toning, the grain structure, even the way the light had interacted with the photographic emulsion over a century ago. Margaret assisted by taking detailed notes and photographs of their findings. "The paper is definitely from the early 1900s, Dr. Morrison confirmed, studying the fiber composition under the microscope. "It's a silver gelatin print on albumin paper, consistent with photography techniques used between." The sepia toning shows the characteristic sulfur compounds used during that period, and moved to examine the image composition. "Now, let's look for signs of manipulation." In 1912, the only way to create a double image would have been through double exposure, composite printing, or physical alteration of the negative. Margaret leaned over his shoulder as he pointed to various aspects of the image on the monitor. Double exposure would create ghosting effects. You'd see overlapping images with varying degrees of transparency. But look at both twins. They're completely opaque, with no transparency or ghosting whatsoever. What about composite printing? That would involve printing multiple negatives onto a single piece of paper. But composite prints from this era always show slight variations in lighting, contrast, or grain structure, where the images meet. This photograph shows absolutely uniform characteristics throughout. Morrison spent another hour examining the areas around each twin, looking for any signs that the image had been physically altered. No evidence of retouching, no signs that portions of the photograph have been cut and pasted. The grain structure is continuous across the entire image. Margaret felt a growing sense of unease. "So you're saying the photograph is genuine?" "From a technical standpoint, yes. This appears to be an unaltered photograph from 1911, showing exactly what it purports to show: a group of children, including two identical boys, positioned on opposite sides of the frame." Dr. Morrison sat back in his chair, removing his glasses to clean them. "Margaret, I've been studying photography for 30 years. I've examined thousands of historical images, including many that were thought to show supernatural phenomena. In every case, I've been able to identify the technical explanation: double exposure, retouching, composite printing, or simple misidentification. But not this one. Not this one. This photograph appears to show something that should be technically impossible." And Margaret walked to the window, looking out at the busy Chicago street below. Eleanor Whitman said she saw one of the twins in two places simultaneously when the photograph was taken. "Mass hallucination is possible,"
I suppose. The stress of posing for a photograph, the bright flash, the cold weather, all could contribute to misperception. But the photograph itself, Dr. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. The photograph doesn't lie, Margaret. Whatever happened that day in Mantionalomance, the camera recorded it faithfully. They were interrupted by a knock on Margaret's office door. Her assistant, Sarah, peered in with an expression of excitement and concern. Margaret, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think you need to see this. I've been researching the Davis family like you asked, and I found something in the Chicago Tribune archives. Sarah handed Margaret a printout of a newspaper article dated February 2010, just 6 days after the school photograph was taken. The headline read, "Mysterious Disappearance of Twin Boys Baffles Police." Margaret read the article aloud. The Chicago Police Department is investigating the mysterious disappearance of 10-year-old twin brothers Thomas and Timothy Davis, who vanished from their family's residence on North Clark Street sometime during the night of February 15th. The boys' parents, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Davis, reported that they checked on their sons before retiring for the evening and found both boys asleep in their shared bedroom. When they went to wake them the following morning, only one boy remained. Dr. Morrison looked up sharply. Only one boy? Margaret continued reading. According to police reports, the remaining child claims to be both Thomas and Timothy, insisting that he has always been one person, despite his parents' assertions that they have twin sons. The boy appears to have no memory of having a brother and becomes agitated when questioned about the missing child. The parents told police that neighbors had previously commented on the unusual behavior of the twins, noting that they seemed to move and speak in perfect unison. It was like they shared one mind between two bodies, said Mrs. Helen Patterson, a neighbor. Now it seems they've become one body with one mind. Sarah pulled out another document. There's more. I found the family's departure records. They left Chicago on February 2, bound for Philadelphia. But here's the strange part. The passenger manifest lists only 3 family members, Robert Davis, Mary Davis, and one child listed simply as Davis boy, age days. Margaret felt the room spinning slightly. One child, not twins. According to every official record, after February 18, 1911, the Davis family had only one son, Sarah confirmed. Birth certificates, school enrollment records, even census data from their new residence in Philadelphia, all show a single child. Morrison stood up abruptly, walking to the window. This is impossible. People don't just marry into one person. Margaret looked again at the photograph, now displayed on the computer monitor in high resolution. The 2 identical boys stared back at her with their dark, knowing eyes. Unless they were never 2 people to begin with. What do you mean? What if the twins weren't actually twins? What if they were one person who somehow existed in 2 places simultaneously? Sarah pulled out one more document. There's something else. I found a medical report from Dr. Harrison Webb, the family physician who examined the remaining child after the disappearance. He noted several unusual characteristics. Margaret took the report and read, "The subject presents as a normal 10-year-old male child, but exhibits several anomalous features. His reflection in mirrors appears delayed by approximately 2 to 3 seconds. When asked to perform simple tasks with both hands simultaneously, he shows confusion and difficulty, as if unused to controlling both sides of his body independently. Most notably, when photographed, the subject appears to cast 2 distinct shadows, despite there being only one light source." The office fell silent as the implications of Dr. Webb's observations sank in. Margaret looked at the photograph again, noticing for the first time that each twin did indeed cast a shadow, but the shadows seemed to overlap in the center of the image, creating a darker area between the 2 groups of children. "We need to find out what happened to this family," Margaret said. Finally, if there are records in Philadelphia, if the child lived to adulthood, if there are descendants who might have answers. Dr. Morrison nodded, but his expression was troubled. Margaret, you have to ask, are we sure we want to pursue this? Some mysteries might be better left unsolved. Margaret looked at the photograph one more time, studying the faces of the other children in the image. Their expressions of unease and fear seemed more pronounced now, as if they had sensed something fundamentally wrong with reality itself. Eleanor Whitman has carried this secret for over a century, she said. I think we owe it to her and to history to find the truth. But even as she spoke the words, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that the truth they were seeking might be more disturbing than the mystery itself. Margaret and Dr. Morrison's research into the Davis family's life in Philadelphia proved both fruitful and deeply unsettling. Working with contacts at the Philadelphia Historical Society, they were able to trace the family's movements after their abrupt departure from Chicago. The Davis family had settled in the Germantown neighborhood of Philadelphia, where Robert Davis found work as a clerk in a textile mill. Mary Davis took in sewing to supplement the family income. Their son, now referred to in all records simply as David Davis, enrolled at Germantown Elementary School in March 19 What made their findings particularly disturbing were the school records from Germantown Elementary. Margaret had requested copies of Davis' academic files, hoping to find some clue about his psychological state after the mysterious disappearance of his alleged twin brother. Look at this, Dr. Morrison said, studying the documents that had arrived by express mail from Philadelphia. Davis' teacher, Miss Catherine Brennan, kept detailed notes about his behavior. Margaret read over his shoulder. March 15, 1930. David Davis is an unusual child. He frequently speaks to empty spaces as if addressing another person. When asked about this behavior, he becomes confused and claims he was talking to himself. He shows remarkable capability, but seems to struggle with tasks requiring individual initiative, as if waiting for someone else to begin first. The notes continued. March 20. He appears startled by his own reflection and claims it doesn't look right. Other children have begun to avoid him, saying he makes them uncomfortable. April 3. During a class photograph session, David appeared to panic when the photographer positioned him for the shot. He kept insisting that he needed to stand in two different places simultaneously. Had to cancel the photography session. Margaret felt a chill reading the last entry. He remembered. Even after the twin disappeared, he remembered needing to be in two places at once. Dr. Morrison had been examining other documents. Here's something interesting. David's medical records from a Philadelphia physician, Dr. Samuel Hartwell. He examined the boy in April 1911. At the parents' request, the medical report was even more detailed than the Chicago physician's notes. The subject presents as a healthy 10-year-old male, but exhibits several highly unusual characteristics that warrant further study. His reflexes appear delayed, as if his nervous system is processing commands for two bodies rather than one. When asked to close his eyes and touch his nose with his right hand, he consistently reaches to a point approximately 3 feet to his left, as if attempting to touch a second nose. Most remarkably, the report continued, when observed in a room with multiple mirrors, the subject's reflections do not appear simultaneously. In the three-way mirrors, only one reflection appears at a time, cycling between the three surfaces in a pattern that defies optical physics. Margaret set down the report, feeling overwhelmed by the implications. Dr. Morrison, what are we dealing with here? This goes beyond unusual psychology or medical anomalies. Before Dr. Morrison could respond, Margaret's phone rang. The caller ID showed a Philadelphia area code. Margaret Thornton, Chicago Historical Society. Miss Thornton, this is Dr. Elizabeth Chen, from the University of Pennsylvania. I understand you've been researching the Davis family from the early 1900s. Margaret was surprised. Yes, that's correct. How did you know? We've bbeen studying the same family for my doctoral dissertation. in anomalous psychology. When I heard through academic channels that someone in Chicago was asking questions about David Davis, I had to call. What can you tell us about the family? Quite a lot, actually. David Davis lived until 1987, dying at the age of 86 in a Philadelphia nursing home. But his life was extraordinary in the most troubling sense of the word. Dr. Chen explained that she had been granted access to David's personal papers and medical records as part of her research into historical cases of dissociative identity disorder. What she had found challenged conventional understanding of human psychology. David never married, never had close friendships, never seemed able to form normal human connections. But he left behind hundreds of pages of journals, and they tell a remarkable story. Marguerite put the call on speaker so Dr. Morrison could hear. What kind of story? David wrote extensively about his experiences as what he called an incomplete person. He claimed that he was only half of who he was supposed to be, that his other half had been absorbed during childhood. He described a feeling constantly off balance, as if his center of gravity was located outside his body. Dr. Chen paused, and Margaret could hear papers rustling in the background. But the most interesting entries relate to his dreams. David claimed that in his sleep, he could still access the experiences and memories of his other half. He wrote detailed accounts of places he had never been, people he had never met, conversations he had never had, all from the perspective of his missing twin. Did they ever mention the school photograph from Chicago? Extensively. He kept a copy of it his entire life, and he wrote about it frequently. According to his journals, he could remember being in both positions simultaneously when the photograph was taken. He described the experience as being torn in half by the camera's flash. Margaret exchanged glances with Dr. Morrison. Dr. Chen, would it be possible for us to examine David's journals and personal effects? Actually, that's why I'm calling. David's estate was left to the University of Pennsylvania for research purposes. I've been authorized to share his materials with other researchers studying similar phenomena. Would you be able to come to Philadelphia? Margaret didn't hesitate. We'll be there tomorrow. That evening, as Margaret packed for the trip to Philadelphia, she found herself returning repeatedly to the 19th photograph. Each time she looked at it, she noticed new details that seemed to support the impossible theory that was forming in her mind. The twins' shadows, which she had initially thought overlapped in the center of the image, actually seemed to connect as if they were cast by a single person standing in an impossible position. The other children's positioning, which had seemed random, actually created a perfect circle around the space between the two twins, as if unconsciously acknowledging that something significant existed in that empty area. Most unsettling of all, when Margaret looked at the photograph under different lighting conditions, she could swear that the expressions on the twins' faces changed slightly. In bright light, they appeared calm and normal. In dim light, they looked frightened, as if they were aware that something terrible was about to happen to them. Dr. Morrison called just as Margaret was closing her suitcase. I've been thinking about what Dr. Chen told us. If David Davis really was somehow two people merged into one, it might explain the technical impossibility of the photograph. How so? What if the camera didn't capture two separate boys? What if it captured one person in the process of splitting or merging? The technology of 1911 might have been sensitive enough to record something that human eyes couldn't fully process. Margaret considered this. You mean the photograph shows a moment of transition? Exactly. A moment when one person briefly existed in two places simultaneously, before something the camera flash, the stress of the situation, some unknown factor forced them back into a single form. As Margaret threw up the phone, she'd realized that their investigation had moved far beyond historical research. They were now exploring the boundaries of human existence itself, trying to understand phenomena that challenged the basic assumptions about identity, consciousness, and the nature of reality. The photograph, which had seemed like a simple historical curiosity just days ago, was revealing itself to be evidence of something far more profound and disturbing. And tomorrow, in Philadelphia, they would finally have the chance to hear the story from the perspective of the person who had lived it. The University of Pennsylvania's Special Collections Library was housed in a Gothic Revival building that seemed appropriate for the mysterious research Margaret and Dr. Morrison were conducting. Elizabeth Chen met them in the lobby, a woman in her early 30s with sharp, intelligent eyes and an air of barely contained excitement. "I have to admit," Dr. Chen said, as she led them through security, "I've been hoping someone else would take an interest in this case. David Davis's story is so extraordinary that I sometimes question my own sanity." She led them to a private research room where several boxes of materials were waiting. David was meticulous about documenting his experiences. "We have journals spanning 70 years, medical records, correspondence, and even some photographs he took himself in later life." Margaret immediately noticed a familiar image propped against one of the boxes, the 1980 school photograph. But this copy was different from the one in Chicago. It was heavily annotated in the margins, with notes written in a careful, precise handwriting. David wrote extensively about this photograph. Dr. Chen explained he considered it the most important artifact of his life, proof of what he called the division. Morrison picked up the annotated photograph, reading the notes aloud. "February 14, 1900. The day I became incomplete. Left side, Thomas. Right side, Timothy. Center, the space where we should have remained whole." Margaret felt a chill. He named the twins. According to David's journals, Thomas and Timothy weren't separate people. They were two aspects of his personality that had somehow been externalized. He described Thomas as his cautious, analytical side, and Timothy as his creative, impulsive side. Chen opened the first journal, dated 1923. David began writing when he was 22, trying to make sense of his childhood experiences. Listen to this entry. "I remember being Thomas and Timothy simultaneously, not having memories of being them, but actually being both of them at the same time. When the photographer told us to stand still, I felt myself in two places at once, seeing the other children from two different angles, feeling the cold air on two different faces." Margaret studied the photograph more closely. The positioning makes sense now. If David was experiencing himself as two people, he would naturally want to position those aspects as far apart as possible to maintain the illusion of separation. Dr. Morrison was examining other materials. "Here's something interesting. Medical records from David underwent extensive psychological testing at the request of his employer, who was concerned about his unusual behavior. The medical report described a series of experiments designed to test David's spatial awareness and self-perception. Subject consistently fails tests requiring accurate self-location. When asked to point to himself in a mirror, he points to a location approximately 6 feet to his left. When asked to estimate his own height and weight, he provides measurements that would be accurate for two people combined. Most remarkably," the report continued, "when photographed with a delayed timer camera that he operated himself, the subject consistently moves to a different position between setting the timer and the flash, as if trying to be in two places when the photograph is taken." Chen pulled out a box of photographs that David had taken throughout his adult life. "These are fascinating and disturbing. David became obsessed with photography, but he could never take a normal self-portrait. The photographs were indeed extraordinary. In image after image, David appeared to be in motion, blurred between two positions. Some photos showed him standing in one location with a clear shadow in a completely different area. Others captured him in the process of moving from one side of the frame to the other, creating an effect similar to a double exposure, but with technical characteristics that ruled out that explanation. He wrote about these photographs extensively. Dr. Chen said, opening another journal, "Here's an entry from 1945. I can feel Thomas and Timothy trying to separate again every time a camera is pointed at me. The flash triggers something deep in my consciousness, a memory of being whole that was interrupted. I move without thinking, trying to be in two places at once, trying to complete the division that was never finished. Margaret was studying a photograph from 1962 that showed David in what appeared to be a park setting. Dr. Chen, where was this taken? According to his notes, that's Rittenhouse Square here in Philadelphia. But look at the background. Margaret looked more closely and gasped. In the background of the photograph, barely visible but unmistakably present, were two child-sized shadows cast by the trees, shadows that didn't correspond to any visible figures in the image. David wrote about seeing Thomas and Timothy in photographs throughout his life. Dr. Chen explained, not as hallucinations, but as actual visual phenomena cameras could capture. He believed that they continued to exist in some form, trying to reunite with him. Dr. Morrison had been quietly examining the journals. Here's something that might explain the original. David wrote about the moment of division in great detail. He read from a journal entry dated fin 26. I have finally remembered what happened that day in Chicago. The photographer's flash didn't just capture our image, it somehow froze the process of division that had been occurring naturally. Thomas and Timothy had been slowly separating from me for weeks, becoming more independent, more distinct. The camera flash interrupted that process, trapping them in a single moment while forcing me to choose which aspect of myself to retain. He chose to remain as David. Chen added, but he spent the rest of his life feeling incomplete, trying to reunite with the parts of himself that had been lost. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the implications of what they were learning. This suggests that human consciousness is far more complex and malleable than we understand. If David could naturally split into multiple aspects of himself, it raises questions about the nature of identity itself. Dr. Morrison agreed. Are we single, unified beings, or are we collections of different aspects held together by some unknown force? Dr. Chen pulled out one final document, a letter David had written shortly before his death. He left it with instructions that it should be shared with anyone who seriously studied his case. Margaret read the letter aloud. To whoever finds this story, I have lived 86 years as an incomplete person, carrying the memories and experiences of three distinct individuals. Thomas, Timothy, and David were never meant to be separate. We were aspects of a single consciousness that was somehow divided by circumstances I still don't fully understand. I have spent my life trying to understand what happened to us, and I believe I have finally found the answer. Human consciousness is not as solid or permanent as we believe. Under certain conditions, stress, trauma, or perhaps just the right combination of factors, it can split, merge, or exist in multiple states simultaneously. The photograph from 1900 is proof that this phenomenon is real and can be documented. But I warn anyone who studies this case, understanding the fluid nature of consciousness can be dangerous. Once you realize that identity itself is malleable, it becomes difficult to maintain your own sense of self. I leave this record not as a curiosity but as a warning. Some aspects of human existence are better left unexplored. The research room fell silent as the implications of David's final words sank in. Margaret looked around at the boxes of materials, 70 years of documentation, of a life lived in fragments, of a person trying to understand his own impossible existence. What do we do with this information? She asked. Finally, Dr. Chen closed the journal carefully. David's estate included specific instructions about his research. He wanted it preserved and studied, but he also wanted it contained. He was afraid that widespread knowledge of consciousness division might lead to people attempting to replicate the phenomenon. Dr. Morrison was studying the original photograph again. The question is, was David's case unique, or are there others? If consciousness can be divided, how many people throughout history have experienced similar phenomena? Margaret thought about Eleanor Whitman, now 98 years old, and carrying the memory of that impact. Eleanor said that the photograph has a way of affecting people who study it seriously. Maybe David's condition is somehow contagious. As they prepared to leave Philadelphia, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that their investigation had opened a door that perhaps should have remained closed. The photograph, which had seemed like a historical curiosity just a week ago, was now revealed to be evidence of phenomena that challenged the fundamental nature of human existence. But there was one more stop they needed to make before returning to Chicago. A visit to David Davis's grave, where they hoped to finally close the circle of their investigation. David Davis was buried in Laurel Hill Cemetery, a sprawling Victorian necropolis overlooking the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia. Margaret, Dr. Morrison, and Dr. Chen made their way through the cemetery's winding paths on a gray afternoon that seemed appropriate for their somber mission. The grave was simple, a modest headstone bearing only the name David Davis and the dates 1919. But what immediately caught their attention was what surrounded the grave: three distinct areas of settled earth, as if three separate burials had taken place in the same plot. "That's impossible," Dr. Morrison said, kneeling to examine the ground. "Cemetery records show only one burial here." Dr. Chen checked the documentation she had brought. According to the funeral home records, David's body was cremated and his ashes buried here. "Thus you're right, this looks like three separate graves." Margaret walked around the plot, noting how the three settled areas were positioned in a triangle, with the headstone at the center. It's as if Thomas and Timothy were finally laid to rest alongside David. As they stood in contemplative silence, Margaret noticed something else unusual. The shadows cast by the three researchers didn't fall in the expected directions based on the position of the sun. Instead, they seemed to converge on the center of the grave plot, creating a darker area around the headstone. Dr. Chen," Margaret said slowly, "when did David die?" "February 14th. In the 76th anniversary of the school photograph." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. It chose the date. Dr. Morrison was photographing the grave site with a digital camera. "Margaret, you need to see this." He showed her the camera cells at the screen. The photograph showed the three researchers standing around the grave, but their shadows appeared to be accompanied by two additional shadow figures, smaller, child-sized shadows that seemed to be holding hands in the center of the plot. "The camera is picking up something our eyes can't see," Dr. Chen whispered. Margaret took several more photographs with her own camera, and each one showed the same phenomenon, additional shadows that didn't correspond to any visible figures. But in the final photograph she took, something extraordinary happened. The two child-sized shadows seemed to merge with a third, larger shadow in the center of the grave. For just a moment, captured in digital pixels, the three shadows became one unified shadow that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. "They're finally together," Margaret said, understanding flooding through her. "David, Thomas, and Timothy, they've been reunited." Chen was studying the photographs on Margaret's camera. "Look at the timestamp on this last image. It was taken at exactly 13:17 p.m. Why is that significant? According to David's journals, 13:17 p.m. was the exact time the school photograph was taken in Chicago on February. He was obsessed with that time, said it represented the moment of his division. Margaret looked at the grave plot again, and for just a moment she could swear she saw three figures standing together, an elderly man flanked by two young boys, all smiling peacefully. But when she blinked, there was nothing there except the simple headstone and the settling earth. As they prepared to leave the cemetery, Dr. Chen handed Margaret a sealed envelope. David left this with specific instruction. It was to be given to anyone who successfully traced his story from the 1919 photograph to his grave. Margaret opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message written in David's careful handwriting. If you are reading this, you have followed my story to its conclusion. You now understand that human consciousness is far more complex and fragile than most people realize. The photograph from Ninto de Mesonce was not an anomaly. It was a window into the true nature of identity itself. I have spent my life as living proof that we are not the solid, unified beings we believe ourselves to be. Under the right conditions, consciousness can split, merge, or exist in multiple states simultaneously. This knowledge is both a gift and a burden. I ask that you use this knowledge wisely. The photograph should be preserved as historical evidence, but its true significance should be shared only with those who can handle the implications. Some truths are too dangerous for widespread knowledge. Thank you for helping me tell my story. In doing so, you have helped Thomas, Timothy, and David finally find peace. The letter was signed simply, David Davis, but underneath the signature were two smaller signatures in a child's handwriting, Thomas and Timothy. Margaret carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. As they walked back through the cemetery toward their car, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple photograph donation and had led them to question the fundamental nature of human existence. What do we do now? Dr. Morrison asked. As they reached the cemetery gates, Margaret looked back at David's grave, barely visible among the trees and monuments. We honor his request. We preserve the photograph and the documentation, but we're careful about how we share the story. Chen nodded in agreement. This case has taught me that there are aspects of human consciousness that we're not ready to understand fully. David's experience was extraordinary, but it was also deeply traumatic. We shouldn't let exposing others to similar trauma without careful consideration. As they drove back toward Philadelphia, Margaret thought about Eleanor Whitman. Still alive at number, she would need to visit Eleanor again, to share what they had learned and to help her finally, but it would be accompanied by a complete record of their research, sealed and accessible only to serious researchers who could demonstrate a legitimate need to understand the phenomena it represented. Margaret realized that their investigation had revealed something profound about the nature of human existence, that consciousness itself might be far more malleable and mysterious than anyone had previously imagined. The baby's twins had been real, but they had also been aspects of a single person who had somehow existed in multiple forms simultaneously. The photograph had captured a moment of transition, a brief instant, when the boundaries of individual identity had become visible. It was evidence that reality itself might be far stranger and more complex than most people could comprehend. As the lights of Philadelphia faded behind them, Margaret felt a sense of completion. David Davis's story had finally been told in full, and the mystery of the 19,000 lens photograph had been solved, even if the solution raised more questions than it answered about the nature of human consciousness and identity. The photograph would remain in the archives, a silent testament to the extraordinary complexity of human existence and a reminder that some mysteries, once solved, reveal truths that are even more mysterious than the original question. In her briefcase, carefully protected, the photograph seemed to rest peacefully for the first time in over a century. The Davis twins, Thomas, Timothy, and David, had finally found the understanding and recognition they had been seeking. Their impossible existence had been documented. Their story had been told, and their fragmented consciousness had been reunited at last. The mystery was solved, but its implications would continue to challenge understanding of human nature for generations to come. 5 years later, the Chicago Historical Society's archives contained one of the most thoroughly documented cases of anomalous photography in existence. The the school photograph of Lincoln Elementary had been studied by researchers from around the world, but access remained strictly controlled according to David Davis's final wishes. Eleanor Whitman had passed away peacefully at the age of 101, finally at rest after learning the truth about the mystery that had haunted her childhood. Her final words to Margaret had been, "Now I understand why we were all so frightened that day. We were witnessing something that wasn't supposed to be possible." Margaret had continued her work as an archivist, but the Davis case had changed her perspective on historical research. She now approached each photograph and document with the understanding that reality itself might be far more complex than it appeared on the surface. The photograph remained in its climate-controlled storage, occasionally studied by carefully vetted researchers. But those who examined it reported the same phenomena that had been documented throughout its history: dreams of existing in multiple places simultaneously, temporary confusion about their own identity, and an unsettling awareness of the fluid nature of consciousness itself. The Davis twins had finally found peace, but their legacy lived on as a reminder that human existence contains mysteries that may be too profound for complete understanding. Their story served as both a fascinating historical case study and a cautionary tale about the dangers of exploring the deepest mysteries of human consciousness. The photograph had revealed its secrets, but in doing so, it had opened questions about the nature of reality that would continue to challenge researchers for generations to come.